Bridge? Well, I have a little work to finish up. Then I'm going to my cabin. I'm going to put my feet up. I'm going to turn on my personal relaxation light. And I'm going to lose myself in the pages of some old novel.
So, Dan, I always like it when we have fresh meat in a Star Trek author, and that's what we're doing on today's show. Welcome, everyone, to Positively Trek. This is our book club episode. I'm Bruce Gibson with Dan Gunther. How you doing, Dan?
Hey, Bruce. Doing well. Really excited to, as you say, talk with a brand new author to the Star Trek universe. A very accomplished author in her own right, but new to our little world of Star Trek tie-in fiction. So very, very excited anytime there's a new voice in the Star Trek literary universe.
And who might that be but Cassandra Rose Clarke? Happy to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Welcome to the show. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
You wrote Star Trek The Next Generation, Shadows Have Offended. And I have to say I was not offended by this book.
Okay, that's very good to hear.
So, yeah, welcome to the show. So those of our listeners who are not familiar with your works, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the other books you've written before we get into this one?
Sure. So I am a science fiction and fantasy novelist. I have published several books. I think at this point it's up to 10. It's so many that I don't have the exact number, and I probably should count it up at some point. But I've written kind of across genres and across age groups. So I have some YA novels out. I have adult novels out. I've written science fiction. I've written fantasy. I even have a poetry book out. So I do a lot. I kind of do a lot of different types of writing. And this is my first Star Trek book, which was very exciting. I've also written in the Halo universe. So I've done some other tie-in work as well.
Excellent. So do you find a significant difference between writing your own fiction versus writing tie-in fiction?
Yeah, I mean, like the basics are the same. Like you still want to have, that plot, character, setting stuff, that kind of just general craft stuff is obviously going to be the same. But you are working within sort of stricter parameters. You can't just do whatever you want. And that was especially true with the Star Trek book, because they have a very set world and there's lots of expectations that fans have. So I had to kind of reel in my own sort of quirks and character styles, because it's like, no, I'm not writing my own character. I'm writing Dr. Crusher, who's a very established character. I'm writing Troi, is a very established character. So that's kind of the biggest difference, I think, is that you have somebody there who is saying, no, this isn't canon, or the characters would never do this, like that kind of thing. Whereas when it's my own world, I'm that person. So I think that's the biggest difference, although I wouldn't call it a challenge. I actually kind of enjoy having those restrictions. Because it sort of forces me to think differently than I would otherwise.
So I would think you would be kind of nervous about writing a Star Trek novel, because there is that established fan base that knows like all the details and everything, and you don't want to get something wrong because somebody's going to call you out on it. Or do you know Star Trek so well that you felt very comfortable with that?
So I love Star Trek, and I love TNG, but I was terrified. I felt like there was a lot of pressure writing a TNG book because of the fan base. And like I said, I love Star Trek too, but I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a real nitpicky fan. But I know that Star Trek is sort of famous for its nitpicky fans. And so I always had like the Star Trek guy kind of in the back of my head as I was writing this book, like, well, and blah, 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 this never happened. So like I definitely, there was a lot of pressure writing this that I actually did not experience with Halo, because that particular fandom doesn't have sort of the reputation that Star Trek has. So I was definitely, when the book came out, I was definitely kind of nervous and, checking my Twitter mentions like, oh, is this going to be the time I check it? And I found out I got something totally wrong. But so far I haven't seen anything, which is good.
Well, I don't know, Dan. You know everything.
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't know what you mean. Star Trek fans, of course, are famously just totally laid back and casual and no, but speaking as some would say one of those uber fans that, all the details and stuff. I loved this novel. I thought it was very good and fit very, very well, especially in that season 7 TNG era that you chose for the story. So yeah, no complaints from me on that part. It was very excellent.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'm really happy to hear that.
Ditto here. But like I said, Dan knows it better than I do. So if it passed the Dan test, you're good. I think you're good. And I also noticed, and Dan and I talked about this the other day, you've worked in a couple of 47s into the book. So good for you. I'll let people figure out where those are. Just look for them. Little hidden Easter eggs there. So let me ask, did you get involved in this? Did you ask to write a Star Trek novel, or did they approach you? How'd that end up happening?
So they actually approached me because of my Halo novels. So I had the opportunity to write in the Halo universe, and the editor who works on the Star Trek tie-ins, he read my Halo books and really liked them. And so he invited me to write Star Trek. I met him at there was a Halo convention that was going on a couple of years ago that I got to attend. And he was there and he was like, "Hey, so do you like Star Trek?" And I was like, "Do I like Star Trek? Yes, I love Star Trek." And then he was like, "Do you like The Next Generation?" And I was like, "That's my favorite one." So it just sort of worked out. And I never would have dreamed, honestly, that I would get to write a TNG book, especially like a standalone, like the ones, because I used to read the standalone TNG books from the 90s when I was a little younger. And I never dreamed I would get to write one. So it was really exciting when he asked me.
Yeah, and this is definitely a bit of I guess you could say a throwback to those types of books, because the literary universe in more recent years has been this kind of post-series tied together continuity. And this is one of the first in many years where they go back and do a standalone novel set during the series. So it sounds like it was right in your wheelhouse and the kind that you enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. And that was actually their suggestion, that they wanted to do a standalone, which I was excited about because I haven't been keeping up with the literary canon, the literary universe in the last few years. But I was like, that's perfect, because those were the ones I loved reading, those just sort of standalone books that were like an extra episode, which was sort of how I approached it when I was writing it. Was, okay, I basically get to write a Star Trek episode. So what do I want to have happen?
And then how did you decide what to happen? Because you do focus a lot on Crusher and Troi and also Worf. So you had to make that decision of, I guess, maybe when to place this story in that timeline and then what characters to focus on.
Right. Well, I kind of went into it. I wanted to write about Crusher and Troi, just because I like to write about women, and they're the two girls, right? So I knew I wanted to write a story that was sort of focused on them, and we get to see them do some stuff. And then the sort of plot was just sort of me spitballing ideas, and just kind of thinking, okay, what kind of stuff can I have happen here? And when I need a plot idea, for some reason, I always go to, there's a mysterious illness and how can we deal with that? And that sort of fits with Crusher. And when I was outlining this, it was right at the start of the pandemic as well. So that kind of sort of came in with the Crusher plotline, where they're on the planet and there's mysterious stuff happening. And I always like that. I always like those kind of episodes where it was sort of like a mystery, like mysterious things are happening. What's going on? What's the logical explanation for this? So that's sort of how I got to the Crusher storyline. The Troi storyline, the sort of Troi Worf storyline, just sort of comes from my love of Betazed and Betazoids and Lwaxana Troi, who I think she's really fun. I know a lot of people complain about her character, but she was always one of my favorite characters because I thought she was funny. And I really love sort of the Betazoid, just like over the top, like weird aristocratic culture that they had. So I wanted to write something where I got to really sort of play around with that, and maybe explore that world a little bit more. And so that's kind of where I came up with the Troi one. And then I was like, okay, now I got to figure out sort of some way to kind of tie these together thematically.
I love when the back cover blurb was released a while ago, and it said basically a cultural ceremony on Betazed, and I went, oh, I think we're getting Lwaxana Troi. I bet you anything.
I just want to compliment you on how you wrote her character, too, because sometimes we'll read in some novels where her character is a little over the top because she can be so fun to write. But you brought her down some to be believable to me, to be in the role that she is and to be in charge of a house, that when things become serious and when she's dealing with other Betazoids, that she can take an authority role in that. And I really enjoyed that. She was still fun, but you kept her just under that level of craziness.
Well, that's awesome, because that was definitely my goal with her. Because I mean, she's an ambassador, so it's like clearly she's got power. She's clearly a professional woman, and I feel like you see more of that in DS9. That kind of comes to the front. So I was sort of inspired by her depictions in DS9. But yeah, I was definitely going for that. So I'm really glad that was successful.
Yeah, and I love that Picard comes to that realization too. There's that moment where he's like, "Huh, well, I guess, yeah, she is an ambassador. I'm impressed with her ability to do it." Like, yeah, like, obviously.
Well, we are going to get into spoilers a little later, as if people have read the book. But before we get to that, talking about the Betazed story and the artifacts, why don't you give us that whole setup?
So in the book, there's basically this big cultural ceremony that is sort of centered around, and these important Betazoid cultural artifacts are going to be basically presented together for the first time. And there's some elaborate like Betazoid shenanigans that explains why they've never been displayed together. And so it's this huge ceremony that was super fun to write, like coming up with all the weird, like celebratory things that the Betazoids would be doing. And so there's a lot of build up. There's this big pageant. We're going to reveal them. And when the curtains or the lights go up and the curtains theoretically or sort of metaphorically go up, the artifacts are gone. And so it becomes sort of this trying to solve a heist and figure out where they've gone, who took them. And of course, all the Betazoids are freaking out because these are super important artifacts. So that's kind of the setup for that.
Yeah, and I noticed that we'll get to the second storyline and that setup, but I noticed how both have mysteries, and I liked how you said earlier how you always start things with kind of like, well, what would be the mystery of this? And it felt like there were two parallel mysteries going. But I will have to say, I'm not usually very good at deciding who done it. I'm not very good with that whodunit stuff. And I was trying in this one. I'm like, I'm going to figure this out early. And of course I was wrong. I wasn't even close. So Dan, how did you do? Did you try to figure out?
I was kind of more just along for the ride. I figured it would be, we recently read another book with kind of a whodunit mystery kind of thing. And I just always get burned because I always craft these theories. I'm like, no, I'm just gonna let this book take me on the ride with this one. So, but yeah, no, I love those kind of, I guess it's almost like a locked room mystery, right? Like, cause they're supposed to be behind this force field and how could this happen? I really enjoyed that mystery and the characters working to figure that out. And Picard's role in it too, where he kind of keeps getting roped back into having to remain on Betazed, and he really wants to go back to the ship, but he's continually frustrated. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, nothing's more fun than putting Picard in a situation where he's uncomfortable.
That is definitely true.
So tell us about the other storyline. We have Riker and Crusher and Data that go on this away mission to a planet.
Right. So basically they have to go to there's this planet that it's sort of in the final stages of being prepared for some colonists who are currently homeless. And they had the away team that was on, or the science team that was on that planet, they lost their commanding officer in an accident. So Riker and Crusher and Data go along with a couple of ensigns, because I just felt like writing some ensigns in there. They go to sort of help with these final preparations. And while they're there, weird things start happening that seem to be tied to a beach that's near the science station. And at first it seems like some kind of illness that affects the biological members of the crew. But then Data starts getting affected as well as the sort of technology that's in the station. And so Crusher is trying to figure out what's going on. She doesn't know if it's a biological illness, which would be, of course, her forte. Is it something, mechanical? What's happening? And so the mystery there is try to figure out what is this? What's causing it? And there's that pressure of how did we not notice this before, when it's in the final stages of being ready for colonists who are literally waiting to move on to the planet.
Yeah, I was kind of tripping at that point because they're having, like, everybody's getting sick, and then they're having dreams. And it's like, okay, there's some kind of weird virus or something going on. And then Data starts having problems and machinery is having problems, all this technology. And I'm like, well, wait, how can something affect them and the technology all at the same time? And that's when I started tripping. I thought maybe I was on the beach. So, we're going to start now getting into the spoilerish territory here. So how did you come up with that kind of idea?
So that was the seed of that was when I first got this assignment. I was going through a phase where I was really into sort of cosmic horror stuff. And I wanted to write sort of a cosmic horror, like Star Trek version of cosmic horror. And so that was sort of the seed of that, was for them to be having these strange sort of unknowable, unexplainable experiences. And then, of course, since it's Star Trek, it can't be some like eldritch deity or whatever. But there's a logical, sort of wholesome explanation for it that we get at the end. But that was kind of the seed, was wanting to have just something that just felt totally irrational and strange, and then the crew having to work through that to figure out what's actually going on.
Yeah, I really appreciated this story. It was, I feel like Star Trek sometimes doesn't go far enough in like how alien and how different situations and beings out there would be. And this one felt like sufficiently mysterious and stuff. And even by the end, we get kind of an explanation and that sort of thing, but they're still so different from us that, there's the thought that, well, this communication probably violates the Prime Directive and that kind of thing. But they're so different that, like, we probably just have to leave them completely alone, because there's that common ground between us is so far apart. I thought that was really interesting. And I love when those kind of boundaries are tested a bit.
Awesome. Thank you. I love writing, just trying to write the most inhuman aliens I possibly can, like in my own writing. So it was I was like, well, if I'm writing Star Trek, I got to try to do that because they're going to be interacting with aliens. So yeah, that was definitely something I was going for.
So let's get into the aliens then. Like I said, we're in spoiler territory. We're just going to assume that at this point, anybody who's listening has read the book or just wants to know everything about the book. But what are these aliens? Like, I mean, I remember you talking about the fossils. So, are they just like these energy beings, or is there some type of physical form that they're working through?
So the idea behind them is that they are a hive mind. They're sort of these microscopic organisms that live on the beach. And they have a sort of a physicality, but when they're taken away from the others, they basically become sort of ossified. And so that's why they were showing up as fossils. Because I don't know, I thought it sounded cool, basically. There was a lot of rule of cool going on. But the way they sort of inhabit this sort of shared dreamscape. So the hallucinations on the beach were them trying to communicate with the crew and sort of trying to bring them into this shared dreamscape where that they sort of inhabit, where they live. So they physically live sort of in the water and in the sand, but they really live sort of in this shared dreamscape. And so the reason they hadn't been picked up before was because there weren't enough crew members, because they're hive minds. So when they see individuals, they see them as dead or as fossilized. And so when they have the extra crew members there, suddenly they're like, oh, these are living things. We need to try to communicate with them. And when that failed, they started to see the technology as living things, because all of the technology in Star Trek, there's that AI that's linked. And they're like, oh, maybe this is actually the intelligent being, because it's linked the way we're linked. So that was kind of what was going on in my head. It was definitely kind of a challenge because I didn't want to have them explain that, because they wouldn't see it that way. Because again, they're supposed to be completely inhuman in their thinking. So that was definitely kind of a challenge with writing them. But that was sort of what I was imagining going on in my head, is that the core idea is that they're a hive mind. And so they were just dormant and didn't try to communicate until the more crew arrived. And they were so strange that they didn't pick up on the scans.
Was it more that they sensed the crew as a hive, or did they see them? Because if they could also visualize and see this hive of people, what did they think of Data?
Yeah, that's actually a good question that I didn't think about. I was kind of imagining them as sort of seeing them and maybe sort of picking up on their brain waves. And so Data wasn't registering as being like the others. And so, or at least at first, he wasn't like the others, so he must be separate, but he was similar enough to the sort of technology that they saw him as part of that sort of AI system. And again, I'm definitely sort of what's the word, techno babbling a little bit, but I feel like that's a classic Trek trope.
Oh yes.
Totally. I also feel like it follows a bit in the Star Trek tradition of kind of this trope that I like that comes up a lot, where some advanced life form or being doesn't see like our crew or people as true life forms. And I'm thinking back to like V'ger in the motion picture, who sees like the Enterprise as a life form, but they're infested by these weird biological units or something. I always like that when, there's that misunderstanding both on our part, like the crew, they don't recognize this as a life form, but the life form also sees these people walking around and they're like, well, those can't actually be alive. That doesn't make any sense. I love that.
Yeah, I've always liked that trope too. And one of the things I love about Star Trek is that it always sort of ends with some attempt at understanding. Whereas I feel in other stories that would result in war, death, or, horrible things. But I like in Star Trek how it always, somehow it kind of works out. And even if we don't totally understand each other, we recognize we don't understand each other and we're willing to move forward.
Is that an aspect of Star Trek that you've fallen in love with? I mean, what is it that you really like about Star Trek?
Yeah, that definitely is. Star Trek is sort of my ultimate comfort watching. Like if I am feeling down, I will just put on TNG. And there's streaming services that I have this free streaming service where they just show Star Trek. Like they have like channels and it's just Star Trek, like 24/7. And so I'll sometimes just put it on and just have it in the background. But yeah, I think that's why it's so comforting to me, is because it's so positive. Appropriately for this podcast name.
That's right.
Is that it depicts such a positive view of the future, and especially that it's sort of post-apocalyptic, right? So we had that sort of apocalypse. Humanity at least had that apocalypse. And then we were able to overcome it. And there's something so satisfying, particularly in TNG, how conflicts are often solved with diplomacy rather than with fighting. And that was always something I loved about TNG. I always loved the episodes where they get out of a fix because Picard talks, right? Like Picard has to be sort of the diplomat, and is able to sort of make this compelling case. And that's something that I love about TNG specifically, but just sort of Star Trek overall is definitely that sort of positivity and sort of just wholesomeness of it. That at the end of the day, is different as we are, like we can still find that common ground.
So going back to the story here, and specifically the characters you're kind of writing about, what was it like so you've watched these characters on TV, you're big fans of them. What was it like to kind of speak in the voice of Deanna Troi or Worf or Dr. Crusher? I've always had this dream of like creating the words that these characters say. And I wonder if you might give some insight into what that experience was like.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it was definitely odd. This book, I mean, it was odd and kind of challenging at first. This book, I had a hard time getting started with it, partially because of the pressure, but also just because of sort of what you're talking about, where I'm like, wow, I'm so used to Picard being Picard on screen, and now I'm like, oh, I have to sort of make him Picard. He has, I'm not writing some character who's called Picard but has a completely different personality. Like, I'm actually creating this Picard, or this Troi, or this Crusher. And so it was definitely kind of challenging. And I definitely went back and sort of watched episodes of it, and tried to even just something as simple as sort of like the way they speak, the actors speak, the way their sort of cadence, when they were playing those characters, trying to kind of get that into the writing. And then kind of letting their personality sort of come through that and kind of going from there. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but
totally. Yeah.
it was because it was definitely a challenge for me.
Yeah, because it's different from all your other books, even the Halo books. You're not playing off of existing actors and their performances.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the Halo books, the characters were all original to me. Even the Spartan character that I wrote. So that was a big challenge for this one. It was very different. It was unlike anything I've ever done before.
Okay, so now you're in the mind of Dr. Crusher trying to figure out this mystery with what's going on with the technology and why are things failing and why are people having these dreams and things like that. What was going on in her head as you're playing her out on the page?
Yeah, so she was really fun to write because all these characters are hyper competent, right? Like, that's one of the appeal of them. And so you have her in this position where she is responsible for her crew, but she doesn't have all of her equipment. She doesn't have her lab. She doesn't have sort of her support system. So she's sort of limited in a way, especially once it starts affecting data, because obviously she's like, I'm not, I know in the show she examines data, but she's got Geordi there with her, I feel. So it's kind of, she's like, how is she going to save these crew members that she has? So it was sort of a race against time, I think, for her to figure out what was going on before somebody got genuinely sick or somebody got hurt. And in feeling that sort of frustration of not having her full sort of retinue of equipment and just resources, and having to just sort of go back to basics.
I kind of like too how she took the authority to really own this, because, even Riker is there, who's the first officer, and he's like, hey, let me come in there and help. No, I got this. You need to stay out, quarantine. And, hey, I'm going to go. And then she's like, I'm going to go check this out. He's like, I don't know if you should. Well, I'm trying to save things. I love how she's taken the lead.
Mm-hmm. Oh, awesome. Yeah. I definitely felt like, as much of it was sort of like a challenge for her, it is also her wheelhouse, because she's a medical doctor, and it at least on the surface, it feels like an illness of some sort. So I definitely wanted to kind of show her in that sort of medical officer role, of being like, hey, this is medical stuff. So this is what I do.
Well, and you got to create some of your own original characters too in both storylines.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that was fun.
You can always go back to them if you ever write Star Trek again.
Yeah, that's true.
So popping over to the other storyline as well, I loved the dynamic of Worf being in command of the Enterprise, and Troi kind of being to Worf what she usually is to Picard. That kind of, not to mention the fact that they also have kind of an intimate relationship that's in its beginning phases here. It makes for an interesting period of time in their lives. Specifically with Troi, one thing I noticed and I really appreciated was the referring to her as Commander Troi more often than she usually is in the show. And like, I love TNG, but I do notice that, everybody is, Commander LaForge, Commander Data, and then it's Counselor Troi and Dr. Crusher, which, there's definitely a dividing line there with the two in their kind of caring capacity and stuff. And I really like the emphasis on her role as an officer in this, which I thought that was really cool.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then, yeah, you put Worf on the bridge in command. And I was just curious because there's been hints in the Picard novels that he eventually is captain of the Enterprise. Did you do that as kind of a shout out to that, or just you wanted to see Worf in that situation?
I just wanted to see Worf in that situation. I have no insider baseball knowledge of Star Trek, so I don't know where they're going on the Picard show. But I just thought it was kind of cool because I feel like the series, especially DS9, he kind of starts going in that direction anyway. And I thought it would be fun to kind of see him in a more, in that more sort of leaderly role as opposed to just being the security officer.
Yeah, and speaking of Worf, why is he on the cover? Tell us about the cover.
I don't know. I was not. I mean, I really loved the art design of that cover, but I was not. I had no say in who they put on it. I was expecting it to be Crusher and Troi myself.
So were we.
Yeah, from all of the kind of pre-release material, that's kind of what we were expecting as well, for sure. And then, of course, the content of the book, I think that would have been more appropriate, personally, myself. But the cover is beautiful, regardless.
Well, they probably say Worf sells, you know? Just like they say Picard's. They've told us, the publishers have told us, and the authors have told us, if you put Picard on the cover, it sells like crazy. Like that's the key. So, yeah. but you didn't get Picard.
That was probably the thinking. Covers are usually a marketing decision, so the author never has any say in them.
No, I do love putting Worf in command in this book, and I feel like it fits in really well with the whole season 7 thing, because earlier in that season we get the Gambit 2-parter where he's the first officer to Data and kind of learns some command lessons there. So I think that works out well, and having Troi by his side kind of advising him really helps as well, because there's a few moments in this book where like the Worf of old would probably fight, but he takes a step back and he kind of takes a beat and says, well, we maybe need to negotiate here, specifically dealing with, as we find out later, the Ferengi. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that was honestly my editor. They were the ones that were like, let's pull him back a little bit. Because I sometimes would want to make him a little more like time to jump over the bridge and start fighting. And they're like, let's pull him back. See, this is season 7. And I think that was a great note because I really liked kind of seeing him still be Worf, but, you know, a little more mature Worf, I guess.
Yeah, he's not running around saying, today is a good day to die.
Yeah.
Well, so, you know, they're chasing down, you know, who stole the artifacts. But now tell us about those artifacts, because the thing I like about it is there's so much value to these things, of bringing them together. But at the same time, they're just common things that would have been used years ago that no one would have thought much of.
Yeah, that was, to me, I felt like that was that was me sort of commenting on, I guess, the way I see Betazoid culture, is they feel, the way they're shown in the shows, they feel so interested in sort of like family lines, and, you know, because the way Lwaxana always introduces herself, the daughter of Fifth House, blah, 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 keeper of the sacred house, all that stuff. And so that was really interesting to me. And I liked the idea of these things not having sort of monetary value, like value to a Ferengi, but being so valuable to the Betazoids that they're like, let's bring in the troops. Like, we need to get these things back. And I thought I was kind of seeing that as sort of a commentary on the Betazoids themselves. Who, like I said earlier, I've always liked them. I always thought they were cool, and just kind of trying to see what that sort of vaguely aristocratic vibe that they have, what that would look like in the Star Trek universe, where again, it's not going to be about sort of subjugation and that sort of thing, but about sort of maintaining these stories and these cultural myths that are important to them as a people.
No, I like that, because I also like that the Ferengi are involved, and even Troy's asking, like, why are you even interested in these things? You know, there's no value to you about these things. And I love how this Ferengi operation are actually female Ferengi working in the shadows, because they're not allowed to be doing this in Ferengi culture.
Yeah.
So that was cool. I like seeing it. And then you get the Romulans. Well, a Romulan, at least, whatever, involved in that. So what was the thinking behind that?
Well, so the Romulan, I needed like a villain, right? I needed someone to steal it, and Romulans are always fun because they're sneaky. But I knew I wanted it to ultimately be Ferengi because I also love the Ferengi, especially the DS9 Ferengi, where they're a little more complicated. When this book was first announced, I actually did another podcast where we talked about different. I got to choose an episode, and I chose the episode. Where that I'm totally blanking on the name of it, of course, but it was the DS9 episode where he hires a female Ferengi and doesn't know. Quark hires a female Ferengi and doesn't know she's female until the end, because they were like, "Well, that doesn't have anything to do with your book," and I was like, "Actually, it does, but it's a spoiler," because I loved that in DS9. Where the women Ferengi, the female Ferengi, start to sort of fight for their rights, but what they want is to earn profit. Like they still want to be Ferengi, which I think is funny. So I knew I had to kind of throw that in there because a lot of this book was, oh my God, I get to write a Star Trek book. So let me cram in everything that I love about Star Trek into this book, try to get as much in there as I possibly can, because I don't know if I'll get to write another one. So I knew I had to get some female Ferengis in there.
I'm going to guess that podcast was Infinite Diversity.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. It was months ago.
Yeah,
so
they're friends of ours. So yes.
Yeah.
I did love that twist, of course, with first of all, that Ferengi turning out to be a female Ferengi. And I always hear Zek's voice in my head.
Yeah.
But also the fact that there's not just one of them. This is kind of a name that this kind of network of women Ferengi have kind of taken on, representing, all these women who have kind of escaped the strictures of Ferengi society and set up these little capitalist ventures for themselves. I thought that was really interesting, and it made me think, like, I kind of want to see this come up again somehow, because that's a really cool idea.
But yeah, I would love to honestly write more about Brit. Her name is Brit the Baron. Her little enterprise, because that was really fun to sort of come up with and imagine. Like I said, I just like the Ferengi. I love the way they went from being these sort of lame villains to just really complicated and funny and like sort of a commentary on modern Americans.
They definitely felt like the DS9 Ferengi, like you said, but there were elements that made it feel like the earlier Ferengi we saw, like the whip was there,
Oh yeah, of course. You got to have the whip, right? It's TNG.
Like the one guarding, the place that they're at, I was like, that seems like the early TNG Ferengi right there. Like, they're doing the, all the grunt work of the place. So is there anything else in this book, though, that we haven't touched on that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I guess I we did sort of touch on it, but something that was really fun for me to write was the sort of creating the Betazoid cultural myth that the objects were built around. And I was kind of expecting the canon people to be like, you can't do this, but they let me do it. So I was like, oh, okay, awesome, because I'm really into sort of cultural myths in general, and that was something. It was fun to sort of come up with the story of why these objects are so important to the Betazoids, and to get to kind of imagine the pageant that sort of tells their story, and the cultural hero Shiamara, getting to sort of come up with that figure was really fun, and that was something that was I didn't quite expect to get to do, so I was excited that I got to do it.
I kind of loved the little bit of playing that you did with the pageantry and the story of it versus the reality of what happened. That was kind of fun, where, Picard was saying like, oh, I learned a bunch of the story from the, before the theft and all that. And Lwaxana is like, well, actually, that's not entirely the story. Here's the real story. They like putting on a show.
Yeah. And that felt like something the Betazoids would do to me too. So,
was there any kind of message you were trying to get across to the reader in this book?
Not Totally. Just because so much of it was sort of plot driven and just trying to figured out stuff to do. But I think maybe one message was, or the sort of theme that I tried to use to link the two storylines was this idea of sort of ingenuity if you're in a situation where you don't have sort of what you're used to having and being able to adapt, basically being able to kind of MacGyver things, because that was sort of the Shiomara story. That was the whole catalyst for the plot with Troi. And then also sort of the Ferengi sort of do that, the female Ferengi sort of get that. And then of course, with Crusher on her mission where she doesn't have the stuff she needs. So that was sort of what I was kind of trying to make the overarching theme of just sort of being able to think creatively and kind of come away with stuff. And then of course I just wanted to have that general Star Trek sense of maybe we don't always understand each other, but we can find that common ground. Like with Picard sort of coming to realize that even though he finds sort of the Betazoids tiresome at times, they kind of have like what they're doing is important. And of course, on the other storyline where like, hey, this idea of communication and being able to communicate with this entity that communicates in a very strange, sort of fantastical way, and how we kind of handle that, or how they handle that.
I love a lot about this novel. This was a really enjoyable experience. And one of my favorite things, and we kind of touched on it earlier, of course, was Lwaxana Troi and the kind of elevation of her character a little bit in the eyes of other people. And I'm thinking specifically the scene where they're contacting the Romulan ambassador as well. And I think we sometimes forget this, that there would be all these connections and stuff. And like Lwaxana Troi's probably sat down in a room with Sarek and negotiated something at some point. And I just love those little connections that kind of make the world seem a little bit bigger and make a bit more sense than what we sometimes get presented with in 44 minutes on screen.
I would love a whole story that's just like Lwaxana Troi being an ambassador, honestly.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yes. No, that would be a good one. I'm going to guess that maybe Lwaxana Troi and Deanna Troi are some of your favorite characters, obviously. Right?
Oh yeah.
So what is it that you like? I mean, we kind of touched on Lwaxana Troi, but what do you like about Deanna Troi so much?
Well, I always like Deanna because she's always such an interesting character to me. And I know it sometimes comes across as sexist in this day and age, that she's sort of like the counselor and she's sort of in that healer role. But that was one of the things I always liked about her. I always related to her because I'm not, watching that show as a little kid. I'm not going to be a soldier or anything like that. And so I always sort of like, oh, maybe there would be a place for me aboard a starship, right? Because if I was going to be anything, I would probably be a counselor. And I didn't always like the stuff they gave her to do, but I think that is an important role in terms of her sort of helping the captain and sort of maintaining the peace with all those crew. You think about all those people who are crammed on a ship. And I know Star Trek, of course, everybody's supposed to get along all of the time, but I feel like her presence there kind of suggests that maybe there's some work to it, right? That she's kind of the one who's helping to make sure, hey, even these little things come up. And that was always something that I liked about her. And of course, as a little kid, it was sort of like, oh, she gets to wear pretty dresses, because I didn't realize, that's actually incredibly sexist that she's not wearing a uniform like everybody else. But I like that as an adult later on when she starts wearing her uniform. I always like that too. We get to finally see her in her uniform.
Yeah, we agree with that for sure.
Absolutely.
I think she even looks better in the uniform,
Yes, she does. Well, because like Star Trek TNG fashion is interesting.
Yeah. I always love to hear Marina Sirtis talk about it too, where she says, they put me in a uniform and suddenly, amazingly, they found interesting things for the character to do, It really affects a lot of, the thinking behind the character and stuff, the impression both to the audience and to the writers. So, yeah.
I mean, because it's a visual medium. And so when you don't have her in the uniform, it's like she's on a different level than the rest of the commanding crew when she's supposed to be on their level. So I do think, like I said, as an adult, I totally get that she needs to be in her uniform, but like as a little kid, like 6-year-old, I'm like, oh, she's a princess, right? So,
well, when I was younger and I was watching TNG, I remember thinking, oh, she probably doesn't wear a uniform because people wouldn't feel like they could open up so much to her as a counselor if she's in uniform. It would be too scary. But if she looks more relaxed and more approachable. But I will say, in the real world of things, Marina Sirtis probably enjoyed wearing the dresses because those look more comfortable than probably wearing a uniform all day.
They totally did, yeah. And I actually think you're right. I always thought that was sort of the justification, is that because she doesn't, like ensigns could come talk to her and feel like they can actually open up to her. So I do get that as well.
So you got through it. You were nervous about getting into the book and writing it, but you got it done. Were there any notes that came back to you that said, don't do that?
There wasn't anything like major. It was mostly kind of like plot stuff, or sort of characterization notes where they're like, okay, this isn't going to work, so we're going to need to sort of rejigger it a little bit so that it'll work. They were always good about giving me suggestions. There was nothing like that comes back. They're like, okay, this entire storyline, not going to work, right? So it wasn't anything major. It was mostly just sort of character notes, and I actually had another character. Probably the biggest change was I had created this commanding officer who was on the planet that Riker and Crusher go to, because I wasn't because it was sort of like they basically brought up like, why would Riker need to go if they already have a commanding officer? Like, what would be the point? So I had to kill her off, but it was really sad because she was, and again, I'm blanking on the name of the species, but she was the cat species from the animated series. And so I'd had so much fun writing her because she was a cat, and she would like hiss and stuff. So that was probably the biggest change. And I totally get logistically, like, yeah, it wouldn't make sense for Riker to have gone if they had a commanding officer already. So she had to get killed off at the start. You never see her in the book, but she was she was one of my creations that I was very fond of.
Oh no, that's so sad. Oh wow, maybe you could do a prequel.
Yeah.
So have you ever been to a Star Trek convention?
I have not, actually. I would love to go someday.
Okay, and then if you do go, are you going to cosplay?
I'm not much of a cosplayer, but I would consider it.
And then would you go as a cat person?
No, I probably wouldn't. Honestly, my dream cosplay was always to go as Lwaxana Troi, because she has this one gown in TNG that is like, the way I remember my boyfriend at the time and I watching it, is this incredibly like modest gown, but then she has this sort of sweetheart cutout that shows her cleavage. So it's like she's wearing long sleeves and this long ball gown, and then you can still see her cleavage. And I always just like kind of loved that dress, and it was like sparkly. And so I always wanted to, if I was ever going to cosplay as a Star Trek character, I would definitely do Lwaxana Troi, just so I have an excuse to basically wear a ball gown.
That particular costume, I think it's the one they based like her Playmates action figure on too.
Yes, yeah. I have that action figure.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Well, it's true too that if you dress like her at a convention, you can act like her too.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have her personality, but I guess it would give permission to just sort of flit around and be Lwaxana for a while.
So you talked about how cool it would be to have like an entire book about Lwaxana Troi and her ambassadorial duties and stuff. With that in mind, and not necessarily saying that's one, that might be coming down the line or anything, would you like to do another Star Trek novel? And are there maybe any plans for that?
I would love to do another one. There are not any plans so far as I know. But I would certainly, if they ask me, I would certainly say yes.
If they ask me, I'll tell them, let her do another one.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm glad I got some people in my corner.
Because honestly,
Totally.
Going into this, I mean, I had a feeling, I trust their judgments of picking authors. So it's like, okay, this is her first one. Am I going to like it? I'm going to like her style. And I really did. And it felt like TNG. It read like, it felt like an episode, but on a bigger stage. It can go and do
Yeah.
things that you can't do in an episode. And the characters were spot on. And I really enjoyed it. It was really enjoyable read.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to hear that.
Absolutely. And ditto.
So tell us about your other books. I mean, I know you have a whole list of them, but, is there something similar about this book that you kind of work into your others?
Definitely some of the sort of super inhuman alien is something that I've done. I have a book called Star's End, which was a space opera type book. That's probably my closest to Star Trek, although it's not remotely like Star Trek. It's just in space. So, but it was really exploring a lot of those themes of sort of like aliens that we don't understand. That was definitely that's like I said, that's something I've always really enjoyed. I also wrote a couple of YA fantasy novels that are currently published as Magic of Blood and Sea that were definitely kind of that. They don't feel like Star Trek, but they were definitely sort of inspired by that sort of adventure, like going on, like exploring new worlds kind of feel, especially of like the original series. Even though it's a fantasy novel, but it just involved sort of bouncing around to lots of different places, which was something I sort of did in this Star Trek book as well, particularly with the Troi episode. I was like, I wanted to be able to have them go to different planets. Like, oh, they go to the ice planet, right? They go to the sort of forest planet, to kind of have them bounce around and explore different places.
That's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything coming out that you're currently working on that our listeners might be interested in checking out if they want to read more of your works?
Yeah, so I have a fantasy novel called The Beholden that's going to be published actually the very start of next year, which is just it's just like that kind of classic epic fantasy. And then I actually have a romance. I mean, I don't know how many of crossover there is, but I actually have a romance novel that hasn't been announced yet officially that'll be coming out probably next year sometime. And I had a YA novel that just recently came out last year called Forget This Ever Happened, which again has those sort of they're not aliens really, but the sort of intelligences that we don't understand and we try to communicate with. So if people were interested in that aspect of this book, they might actually really like Forget This Ever Happened, even though it's sort of a YA like teen book, but it has like some weird sort of alien creatures in it.
The one thing I want to cover before we end the show with you is just to let you know, my daughter who's 19 wants to be a writer, and she reads a lot of YA books, and she's writing all the time. Like, I have to leave the family room because she paces in the circle, and she has a dry erase board where she's writing our ideas. And she's written several novels, nothing published or anything, but she's just, it's practice, and write to get better and better. How did you get into writing, and then it led to publishing?
So I've always loved to write. I was sort of like your daughter, actually. I used to write just constantly. I remember in 5th grade, we had this assignment where we would have like our spelling, our list of spelling words, and we have to write stories using those words. And most people would write like a page, and I would write like these 20-page stories, 30-page stories that my poor teacher had to read. I just always loved writing. I used to tell myself stories constantly. And I, in college, the way I kind of got into publishing was I minored in creative writing and then went on to get an MFA in creative writing. So that was sort of on the literary fiction side of things, but I've always loved science fiction and fantasy and horror. So basically I was writing that stuff in my MFA. I just did it and didn't really care what they said. And then when I graduated from that and I started focusing on getting published, that was sort of when I discovered science fiction conventions and sort of the online science fiction publishing world, which was how I sort of started learning about the publication process. But I definitely did a ton of writing before I started even thinking about publication. It was basically because I graduated my MFA program and I was like, oh, now what do I do? Right? So I guess I got to find out what the next steps are.
And then you made it to the 24th century.
I did. And then I got to have this like huge, amazing goal of writing a Star Trek book.
I'm so jealous. I couldn't write one. I know I couldn't. Dan and I kind of fantasize we'll write one together someday. But I think I would have good ideas, but I just don't like my writing. I would have to rely on Dan for that.
Well, we'll see.
Well, if people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
So I am, honestly, that's probably the easiest is to just go to my website, which is CassandraRoseClarke.com. And that's Clarke with an E at the end, Clarke. If you Google my name, it all pops up. I have links to all my social media. I'm on Twitter at crc.com, which is like the worst handle to say audibly. It's SEEORSEA, like C or C, which is supposed to be my initials. When I came up with it, I didn't realize. I was like, wait a minute.
You were getting too creative there.
Yeah. But I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook as well. I'm all the standard social media sites. But I have links to them from my website. So that's probably the easiest way to find me.
Great. Let me tell you something. I'm going to ask you a favor because Dan has a YouTube channel where he talks Star Trek and he just needs a few more followers. So Dan, tell us about that.
My YouTube channel is Kurtrats Productions, and Kurtrats is just Star Trek backwards. So it's youtube.com/Kurtrats Productions.
Great. And where can they find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kurtrats, again, KERTRATS. And of course, in the Positively Trek discussion group on Facebook, my favorite hangout on the entire internet.
And you can find me on the internet, Bruce Gibson spelled backwards. No, I'm kidding. No, I'm on the internet too, unfortunately. I'm on Twitter at Admiral_Rex. And I'm occasionally on the Star Wars Report podcast and been doing some guest things on literary treks. So that, and of course we got our Facebook group. We have the best Facebook group. It's a discussion group. Cassandra will let you in. And everybody's positive, right? Positively Trek. It's wonderful. It's great. So everyone just search for us there. We have the Facebook page, but then we have the Facebook group, the discussion group. So look for that. And we also have a Goodreads group too, where you can follow which novels we're going to review here on the show. So there you go. So Cassandra, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
And I hope to have you back sometime and maybe to discuss another Star Trek book that you wrote.
That would be awesome.
Absolutely. That would be terrific.
And thanks everyone for listening. Find us on Patreon to support the show. We'll have little perks in there for you. And a reminder to everyone, and that is stay positive.